I might say, incidentally, that the days of finding Baconian ciphers is not yet over. There was a book written as recently as 1987, which is in our library, and I consulted it in preparing for this lecture. It's called The Cryptographic Shakespeare. And if any of you are interested in these books, incidentally, I have call letters and so forth in the University of Michigan library. Well, that was the first major contender, Francis Bacon. Then in the 20th century, along came another one. And the person who advanced his cause had a rather unfortunate name, I think we will all agree. His name was J. Thomas Looney. And the people who oppose his ideas naturally have a good deal of fun with that name. Well, he's a very interesting person. He concluded, on the basis of the evidence that I've been talking about today, that Shakespeare of Stratford could not possibly have written the Shakespeare plays and poems. If not, then who did? So he conducted a long, ingenious investigation. And the name that he came up with, that he felt fit the criteria, was the name of the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Agatha Christie was so impressed with what he had done that she complimented him on his great detective work. And I think it was, at least looking at it from that point of view, a wonderful, marvelous exhibition of historical scholarship to find somebody that nobody had ever really thought of before as a person who could have written these plays. What about the Earl of Oxford? He was born in 1550, 14 years before Shakespeare was born. He knew the Earl of Southampton, and he would fit the image of the patron that's reflected in the sonnets much better than the much younger Shakespeare. There's a reference to lameness in the sonnets, and the Earl of Oxford was injured in a duel and thereafter was lame. He had a mistress who might well have been the dark lady of the sonnets. He was a member of the nobility. His father-in-law, Lord Burleigh, served in Queen Elizabeth's court, and Burleigh is believed to be the model for the character of Polonius in Hamlet. Gertrude's sudden marriage to Claudius in the Hamlet play after the death of her husband reflects Oxford's own experience. His mother married quickly after his father's death. Oxford was well educated. He traveled extensively, wrote poetry of high quality. He was deeply interested in the theater, and he actually wrote plays that were performed in the court. But he stopped writing under his own name in 1593 when the first Shakespeare work appeared. What was his reason for hiding his authorship? Well, it's very similar to the reasons that are attributed to Bacon. It was acceptable for noblemen to write plays for the court, but it was beneath their dignity to write plays for the masses, as Shakespeare did. Well, that's the reason he hid his authorship. The principal problem with the Oxford claim is that he died in 1604. And that was before some of the great Shakespeare plays were written, such as Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, and The Tempest. Now, I say that was before they were written. That was before the estimates of the conventional scholars about when they were written. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, the anti-Stratfordians argue that they should be dated 10 years earlier. What about the first folio that came out in 1623? The Oxfordians argue that those involved knew that Oxford had written the plays, and they felt that they still had to protect his name, even though he'd been dead since 1604. We might wonder why further protection was necessary. Ben Jonson, when he referred to the sweet swan of Avon, was actually referring to Oxford, the Oxfordians believe, because Oxford had property on the Avon River. That's stretching it. The most prominent contemporary supporters of the Oxford theory are Charlton and Dorothy Ogburn. And some couple of 3 years ago, I saw a PBS program, public television program, about this controversy. And Charlton Ogburn was one of the main participants. I don't know whether any of you saw it or not. But Ogburn actually almost broke down in tears. And it was legitimate. He was very emotional because he said history had deprived Oxford from the recognition that he so richly deserved as a result of writing the Shakespeare plays. He really believed that he had written them, and he believed that we should all recognize him. Ogburn, incidentally, wrote a number of books, and his wife with him, and one of them is in our library, Shakespeare, the Man Behind the Name. And it's a very interesting book to read. He just absolutely pours mud all over Shakespeare of Stratford. He has no use for him whatsoever. Well, here we are. Where does this all leave us? I think the weakest part of the anti-Stratfordian case is the reason why the authors conceal their identity, at least after why they wanted to conceal it, or why anybody would want to conceal it after they had passed away. Ben Jonson outlived them all. Why would he not reveal the true author's name, considering his tremendous admiration for these works? And that's a difficult question to answer. I think it's not too astonishing that the real authors conceal identities on occasion. We're all familiar with that. Walter Scott kept the authorship of his novels a secret for some time because he felt it would injure his reputation as a poet. And Mary Ann Evans called herself George Eliot because she felt that she'd get greater recognition if the readers thought she was a man rather than a woman. And Mark Twain, of course, is another example of a pseudonym, although he never made any effort to conceal his identity. But I think a question that we have to ask about Bacon's claim and Oxford claim is, why did they hide their authorship behind a real person's name? Because Shakespeare of Stratford was a real person. Could they expect that they had once given credit to him, that they could eventually take it away from them and say that they wrote the plays? I think that was a little bit too much to expect. Sometimes in their zeal to establish their cases, the proponents of various candidates do, I think, go to extremes. For example, in As You Like It, there's a character named Sir Oliver Martext. And the people who support Marlowe's claims say, see, that proves that he wrote As You Like It, Martext, Marlowe's text. Some have wondered why Shakespeare skipped Henry VII in writing his historical plays. And the answer the Baconians give that supports his claim is that Bacon had written a biography of Henry VII, and he didn't want to do it again. In the first folio, in referring to Shakespeare, Ben Jonson said, "Thou art a monument without a tomb." Well, by 1623, there was a tomb to Shakespeare in Stratford, and Jonson would have known this. So obviously, he couldn't have been talking about the Shakespeare who was buried in Stratford. Well, you evaluate that reasoning on your own. One fact seems particularly damaging to the Oxfordians, and that is that an Elizabethan figure named Francis Mears in 1598 listed both Oxford and Shakespeare as contemporary playwrights. That seems to show that there were two of them. But the Ogburns and the Oxfordians don't take that. They said, oh, that was just all part of the conspiracy to hide Oxford's authorship, and that he got Mears to do this so that the word wouldn't get out that he'd written the plays. That does seem like circular reasoning to me. On the other hand, I don't think it's quite enough for conventional scholars just to sneer at these claims. I think that there's enough to them that they deserve some kind of good answer, and there isn't much material on this from the conventional scholars. They just don't talk about it. They just accept the fact that Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays, and not worth discussing this silly little controversy. But a lot of distinguished people have either been intrigued and, in fact, actually believed that somebody other than Shakespeare wrote the plays, and among them are Oliver Wendell Holmes, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, John Galsworthy, Walt Whitman, Sigmund Freud, Mark Twain. They all believe that somebody other than Shakespeare wrote the Shakespeare plays. There have actually been formal debates on this controversy. In 1953, Fairleigh Dickinson University was the scene of a debate between the Oxfordians and the Stratfordians. And the jury voted 8 for Stratfordians, 4 for Oxford. In much more recent times, in 1987, a similar debate was held in Washington, D.C., and 3 Supreme Court justices served as the judges of the debate. William Brennan, who just recently retired, John Paul Stevens, and Harry Blackmun. When the debate was over, they all agreed that the Oxfordians, from a legal point of view, had failed to prove their case. Brennan came down most strongly on the side of the Stratfordians. He said that the Oxford proponents had failed to show that the plays reflected the vast knowledge that most people say is in them. They also failed to show that Shakespeare had never been exposed to education. Stevens and Blackmun, although agreeing with the legal verdict, expressed much greater uncertainty about whether the Shakespeare of Stratford could possibly have acquired the background needed to write the plays. My recollection is that this is written up in that New Yorker article that I referred to earlier. Recent investigators have turned to computers in an attempt to solve the mystery. It was conducted at Claremont College and just recently released in the last couple of years, I think it is. And they took Shakespeare's language and the language of various pretenders to the crown. All in all, 3 million words were put into a computer, including more than 800,000 of Shakespeare's. And this study, if you accept it, eliminated the main contenders, including Bacon, Marlowe, Oxford, but it did leave one obscure pretender, Fulke, F-U-L-K-E, Grayville, as a remote possibility. Overall conclusion of this computer study was that the Shakespeare of Stratford must have written the plays. And that would, I presume, be matching, say, Shakespeare's language against Bacon's language, to see whether the person who wrote the Bacon works could have written the Shakespeare works, that sort of thing. In some desperation, people have actually turned to the spirit world to get an answer to this question. And one person did manage to contact, in this spirit world, Shakespeare, Oxford, and Bacon. And this is what he found out. Shakespeare told him, "I worked out the plots." Oxford said, "I wrote the dialogue." And Bacon said, "I did the polishing and revision." So the Shakespeare plays were the product of 3 people. And somebody asked me during the intermission about whether any multiple authors have been proposed, and I only knew about this one. I haven't heard of any others, and I don't know whether there are any other multiple authors that have been proposed. The novelist Henry James once said, "I find it almost as impossible to conceive that someone other than Shakespeare wrote the plays as to conceive that the man from Stratford did." So he put himself right in the middle, didn't he?